Hello, everybody. On this Monday, June 20th, I'm Spencer Mazyck, and this is the Bloomberg Law Podcast, a series of interviews focusing on trends in the busy legal profession. In recent years, the oil and gas industry has revamped a drilling technique called hydraulic fracturing or fracking to unlock natural gas reserves trapped underground. These reserves could supply the U.S. with gas for up to 100 years. So why are some folks calling for a ban on fracking? Joining us to discuss the risks and regulation of fracking is Elizabeth Burleson, a Pace Law School professor. Welcome, Professor Burleson. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. Well, so, Professor, tell me, is there a significant amount of natural gas trapped underground in the U.S.?
Yes, there's roughly as much traditional as non-traditional natural gas. And again, it's not going to last forever, but it's being described lately as a transition fuel if we're going to try and get off of some of the traditional forms of fossil fuels that cause, the greenhouse gas mitigation.
Well, do we have a sense of where the gas is located in which states?
Well, you've got a Barnett Shale in the Texas area. You have a Marcellus Shale that runs along the Appalachian Range, and extraction's already occurring in places like in Pennsylvania. And then you have in New York a moratorium and efforts to try and make sure that there's some regulation for groundwater.
One of the ways to obtain this gas is through a process called hydraulic fracturing or fracking, as it's commonly called. What is fracking?
So it's interesting because for the industry, they tend to use phrasing as their shorthand, and opponents tend to use fracking, and proper terminology is hydraulic fracturing.
I didn't know that.
So
interesting distinction.
And people are writing both, and the media has tended to lean towards fracking. So it is in fact common terminology to say fracking, but it's primarily water, and then sand, and then some fluids that help keep the sand suspended and lubricate.
What are the chemicals used in fracking then?
So there's a potential range of over 700, and generally not nearly that many are used at any one time. But it's also really important to keep in mind that each location is really specific. It's shale, but it's a different sort of shale. So what works in one location might not
necessarily work in another.
Yeah, so when you're talking fracking fluid or freezing fluid or hydraulic fracturing fluid, you're not necessarily talking about the exact same thing that's being used in, say, Ohio versus New York versus Pennsylvania versus Alabama versus, Texas or now in the UK, Israel, all the different places that are starting to look at this. And it is, in fact, a lucrative thing to have sorted out what works best in one location. So the companies arguably have a vested interest not to share that information.
Right, and keeping that protected, it's almost like a trade secret. And I know that a colleague of yours, Hannah Wiseman, actually wrote an article that I read about them saying that the chemicals that they use in the process is a trade secret. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
And Professor Hannah Wiseman's done both in Fordham and Columbia and Villanova a whole series of articles that really speak well to this conflict between trying to meet the needs of environmental integrity as well as public health, because even when you get workers that come to emergency rooms, nurses are now getting exposed to acid levels and they don't know what they're working with. On the other hand, in intellectual property, companies deserve to be able to protect their trade secrets.
I want to get to what everyone's been talking about, which is the risks of hydraulic fracturing. Does it pose a real threat to our air and water supply?
So you have methane leakage, which the Cornell study talked about greenhouse gas. Using that as the frame, you've got methane leakage being of greater concern than bringing down carbon levels. So in that context, you're impacting atmospheric greenhouse gas climate change numbers. In the Duke study, you were talking about the fact that methane was getting into drinking water, and it wasn't clear how. It wasn't necessarily the fracking solution. Diesel wasn't necessarily getting into the drinking water, but the methane was.
And I read that study because they said that gas could transport in the gas phase from the shale formations to the groundwater.
And they thought perhaps it's coming up partially through natural fissures and then combined. That was one possibility, but it was by far more likely that the natural gas was getting in the groundwater and then in the drinking water in locations directly around these hydraulic fracturing sites.
Which brings up, I hate to interrupt, but it brings up an interesting point to me, because I don't know whether or not you've seen this film, but it's an Oscar-nominated documentary called Gasland by Josh Fox, and in it there's this famous image of one of the folks who live near one of the fracking sites actually is lighting water on fire. So he
turns on his water tap and he literally gets a ball of fire coming out of his kitchen sink.
Yeah, and I know you're not a scientist, but is it likely due to the methane contamination?
They're getting the very strong sense that it's methane. One of the things that New York is trying to do in terms of regulations is make sure that they have both before and after understanding. And so in the locations where this has occurred, there hasn't necessarily been a sufficient understanding of what were the methane levels before this fracking or hydraulic fracturing started. And so, yes, it seems likely, it seems highly likely, but there isn't, in environmental law generally, you don't always have a good baseline to know what you're starting with. But in addition to that, one of the most important aspects of the risk is the risk to depletion of groundwater levels and the risk of what's being done with the wastewater. And right now you're getting wastewater taken to ordinary sewage treatment plants that don't have the means by which to try and filter or properly deal with the wastewater.
Is it regulated on a federal level? You hinted at some states that are regulating it, but is it regulated on a federal level?
So arguably it ought to be under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it's not, because a waiver of the provision 1421 in the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Energy Act of 2005 created a waiver, and so our provisions, our environmental provisions that try and regulate this type of activity don't necessarily do so as comprehensively as they might, and that's why people are arguing that they should reestablish that fracking solutions should fall under the underground injection program in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and perhaps also the hazardous waste under RCRA, which was in '88 also taken out.
Yeah, that was dubbed in the media actually as the Halliburton loophole or exemption. And I think it's interesting that do we know the rationale behind this amendment? Because I also understand that the Clear Water Act was amended, but do we have any sense as to what Congress was thinking?
The Energy Act of 2005 clearly had national security and home energy as its predominant theme. Yet throughout federal law, we believe firmly in human health and welfare and protecting environments as well. So how to balance that properly? You've got a really interesting situation right now with the Delaware Water Basin Commission being a federal entity. It gets federal funding, and it gets has Army Corps of Engineer involvement, and you've just very recently have the state of New York suing because the state of New York now has this moratorium, but the Delaware Water Basin Commission may well start regulating, and the state of New York wants to make sure that those regulations are done in a manner that follows NEPA, and that's another one of our federal environmental statutes.
Well, so there seems to be some federal regulation, and then it sounds like you're saying that the states are also regulating fracking. And I have to mention that on Friday, Texas Governor Rick Perry signed into law a bill that will require companies to make public the chemicals they use on fracking jobs in the state of Texas.
So it certainly is. That's a partial disclosure law. That's not a full disclosure law because it leaves open the trade secret that we discussed earlier and that Hannah's written on, that you need to, it's a balance. It's probably going further than most states have, but and they are posting to a site called if you go to, okay, so I'm forgetting the exact
URL.
And
the name's not relevant, but I think we get the point here.
But they're not posting all the chemicals.
I wanted to ask you, do you think that there's any process of the fracking, any part of the fracking process that isn't regulated that probably should be?
I think there arguably needs to be a disclosure of the fracking chemicals so that people know what their risk exposure is. And at present, we don't have a scientific basis, so the National Academy of Sciences ought to be doing a full study on hydraulic fracturing so that we then have cradle-to-grave analysis on the aspects of not just the hydraulic fracturing, but the drilling, the casement issue with the cement, how stable that process is, are the drilling solutions escaping the leakage of the methane and the wastewater, and can you actually find ways to make the hydraulic fracturing solutions less toxic, use more benign chemicals, or additionally, how can you try and make it less water intensive? And so when energy is very water intensive and water is very energy intensive. But in this context, we're talking about something that might make sense in the context of bringing down carbon, but is going to have a lot of other implications, and particularly the radioactivity aspect of it, which isn't in the fracking solutions per se, but is coming back up in the wastewater, is something that isn't currently being studied. So New York's got its moratorium until it finishes the process of its revised supplemental generic environmental impact statement, and that's open for public comment, and it probably won't come out until at least the fall at the earliest. But the scope of the studies that are being conducted both at the EPA level federally and at the state level aren't necessarily looking broadly enough at beyond the hydraulic fracturing fluids themselves and the chemicals in those fluids.
Okay. Well, and if regulated, then should we as a culture, as a society, embrace hydraulic fracturing?
If sufficiently regulated, I see this happening. I think communities should be able to use information that's put in the public domain that clearly identifies the range of chemicals being used, and that buffer zones should be put around public drinking supplies, aquifers. We should have a very, very comprehensive, we should not be permitting beyond our capacity to monitor, and we should be doing water quality tests both before and after, downstream, ongoing tests, and yes, that's all going to cost money. So it needs to be funded properly. This is going to be a very lucrative field that is simply going to ramp up. A substantial part of Chesapeake is Chinese investment. You're getting many international players in both as investors, and the stakeholders have asked for disclosure, not all of them, but there are stakeholders that have asked for disclosure. So corporate responsibility in the form of knowing what those chemicals are, and corporate responsibility in terms of having best practices. And I think we should raise up the best practices and the best companies and highlight what is working well so that the other companies can start using these best practices.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. But it sounds like whether or not fracking, we embrace it, it's going to be here to stay. But thank you very much for sharing your insight with us today. We greatly appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much.
When we come back, our spotlight on contributed content. We'll be back in a moment.
Digital technology has transformed the way we live our lives. We can access any piece of information at any time from anywhere. We can share ideas with thousands of people instantly. Staying up to date with breaking news and events is easier now than ever before. All this lets us keep pace with the world in real time. Yet, have any of these innovations been applied to the way we research and practice law? Starting today, the answer is yes. Welcome to Bloomberg Law, the first and only real-time research system for the 21st century legal practice, created by the leading provider of data and information services. A single search feature with access to legal, news, and company databases provides you with powerful legal research results and a holistic view of your clients, filtered so you know the information you receive will be relevant every time. Customizable legal, financial, and news alerts keep you ahead of your clients and in tune with their world. An integrated workspace allows you to organize your results by client, by urgency, by topic, however you want it, and to share those results with people on your team. Log in now to experience Bloomberg Law.
Now it's time for our Spotlight on Contributed Content. This is a segment where we highlight an article that was featured in one of our Bloomberg Law reports. Today's article comes to us from Glenn Berger, Cheryl Foley, and Alexander Cook of Skadden Arps. The title of the article is Electric Transmission, the Feds Are Here to Help. In the article, the authors discuss recent efforts by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to encourage the development of new electric transmission. This is a great article, and you can find it in the June 13th issue of our Bloomberg Law Reports Technology Law on the terminal at BTLR or at BloombergLaw.com. Articles are contributed to us for publication by practitioners, law professors, and other legal experts. To find out more about how you can contribute, please visit BloombergLaw.com. A special thank you to the Skadden attorneys for that contributed piece. And again, our thanks to Professor Elizabeth Burleson of Pace Law School. Bye, everybody. Yeah.